the medieval coffin that was sealed from the inside. Somewhere in the crypt of an old European church, workers once opened a stone coffin that had not been touched for 600 years. What they found inside made the oldest man in the room drop his lantern and back out of the chamber without a word. You are standing over that coffin now. The lid is heavy, cold, carved with a name half eaten by time. The air around it smells of dust and old iron. And when the workers finally slide the lid aside, the light of your torch falls on something no one is prepared to see. Not bones arranged in peaceful rest, not the folded hands of the faithful dead, but scratches, long, desperate scratches, carved into the underside of the stone. Scratches made by human fingernails. This wasn't a burial in the way you're thinking. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a story from a horror novel. What happened inside that coffin was something the medieval world knew about, feared, and quietly refused to write down in plain words. And tonight, we're going to find out why. Welcome to Medieval Secrets Unlocked. The coffin no one was supposed to open. Picture yourself as a stonemason in a small European town, called to the church on a cold morning to help repair the crypt beneath the altar. You have worked on graves before. You're used to bones. You're used to the smell. What is waiting for you today, you'll never be used to. The priest leads you down a narrow stair by torchlight. The steps are worn smooth by centuries of feet. At the bottom, in a low chamber where the air does not move, there are several stone coffins along the walls. One of them, the oldest, has a lid that has slipped slightly out of place. The priest asks you to help him restore it, so the dead can rest in peace as they should. You set your tools down. You put your hands against the cold stone. You brace your legs, and with the priest pushing beside you, the lid moves. Just a few inches. Just enough for the torch to shine inside. And in that moment, both of you go very still. The bones inside are not lying flat. The skull is turned to one side. The arms are folded up against the chest, as if the person had been trying to push something away. And on the inner surface of the lid, catching the torchlight in shallow, uneven lines, are marks that should not be there. Marks that look unmistakably like the tracks left by fingers scratching stone. The priest crosses himself. He tells you to slide the lid back into place immediately. He tells you to speak of this to no one. And that night, as you lie in your bed, you understand that you have seen something the medieval world was quietly holding as a secret. But to understand how a person could end up sealed inside a coffin from the inside, we need to go back. The fear that built the coffin. Long before that lid was opened, a very specific fear haunted medieval Europe. It was not the fear of ghosts. It was not the fear of hell. It was the fear of waking up in the wrong place at the wrong time. You have to remember what medicine looked like in this world. There were no stethoscopes. There were no heart monitors. A physician pressed his ear to a chest and listened. He held a polished piece of metal beneath a nostril to see if it fogged. He watched for the rise of a rib, the faintest movement beneath the still chest. The twitch of an eyelid, the slightest flutter beneath closed lids was what he sought. The faintest sign that life was still hiding somewhere in the body. And when he could not find any of those signs, he declared the person dead. Sometimes he was right. Sometimes he was very, very wrong. Because certain conditions can slow the human body down to a point where even a careful observer will miss the signs of life. Deep fevers followed by exhaustion. Certain poisonings. Strokes. Extreme cold. Some illnesses cause the pulse to become so faint and the breath so shallow that a person can appear to be gone for hours while still lingering inside their own body. Unable to move, unable to speak, unable to warn the family weeping over them that they are still there. In such an age, being buried alive was not a rare nightmare. It was a real, documented risk. Chroniclers across medieval Europe recorded stories of graves opened years later that contained skeletons in unnatural positions. Priests wrote of hearing sounds from freshly closed tombs. Families passed down grim traditions of waiting several days before burial, of pricking the skin with a needle, of holding vigils over the body long past the point when logic said the person was truly gone. The fear grew so deep that it began to shape the design of the coffins themselves. The process that crossed the line. Now here is where the story takes a turn that most people never learn. For the wealthy, for the powerful, for anyone who could afford to be afraid in an organized way, coffin makers began quietly building something extraordinary. Coffins with small features that had no purpose for the dead. A hollow tube running from the interior up through the earth to the surface. A small bell attached to a string that ran down through that tube and looped around the finger of the corpse. A latch on the inside of the lid, designed to be opened by hands that were supposed to be past all opening. These devices did not become widespread until later centuries, in the age that followed the medieval world. But the fear that produced them, and some of their earliest and crudest ancestors, reached back deep into the medieval mind. Certain noble families in Europe reportedly requested that their tombs be built with a way for the occupant, in the very worst case, to signal or even free themselves. Now imagine what it meant to actually use such a coffin. Imagine waking up in complete darkness. The air is thin. The smell is heavy. Your fingers touch stone above you, stone beside you, stone below you. You try to shout, and the shout dies against the lid. You try to move, and the space is so tight that your elbows scrape the walls. Slowly, you understand where you are. Slowly, you understand what has happened. And slowly, with hands that are already trembling from cold and terror, you begin to feel along the interior for the small mechanism your family paid to have installed. Some of them, in the surviving accounts, found it. Most of them did not. Death was mercy. This was not death. The people who woke up underground. Who were the people who ended up in this situation? They were not the villains of history. They were, in most cases, ordinary human beings caught by the limits of the medicine of their time. Picture a young woman in a small European town, laid out in her family's home after a long fever. Her mother has closed her eyes. Her father has arranged her hands upon her chest. The priest has spoken the final words. Neighbors have filed past to say goodbye, weeping quietly, remembering her as she was. The coffin lid is closed. She is carried to the churchyard. Earth is shoveled onto the wood. The mourners walk home. And somewhere in the hours that follow, her mind returns. She does not know where she is. She only knows that everything is dark, that her chest is heavy, that her throat is dry, and that when she tries to move, her hands strike what a hand's breadth above her face. The scream that comes out of her is not heard by anyone. The village is asleep. The churchyard is empty. Her family is already home, mourning her. Chroniclers recorded stories like this across medieval Europe. In some accounts, workers digging a new grave beside an old one heard sounds coming from beneath the earth and opened the coffin in time to save the person inside. In other accounts, they arrived too late and found only signs of what had happened. Torn shrouds, broken fingernails, positions of the body that spoke without words of the final hours. Behind the walls of many old European churchyards, if the ground could speak, it would tell stories the priests never entered into any parish book. Stories the families were never told. Stories that ended in silence, not because there was no scream, but because there was no one close enough to hear it. What the movies got wrong. Now here is where almost everything popular culture has taught you about this needs to be turned upside down. When films show a person waking in a coffin, they show wooden boxes cracking, hands bursting through soft soil, dramatic escapes into moonlight. That image sells tickets. But the medieval reality was almost the opposite. The people most at risk of this fate were often the wealthy, buried not in soft earth but in stone, under a church floor, inside a family crypt, beneath a heavy carved lid that no living hand from inside could ever lift. The poor, ironically, were sometimes safer, buried quickly in shallow ground, in simple shrouds, without heavy stone above them. If they woke, there was at least a chance that someone might hear, or that the earth might shift. The rich, who could afford the finest tombs, sealed themselves into ruins of granite from which no return was possible. And here's what history books rarely mention. Many medieval families knew this risk perfectly well. They chose the stone tomb anyway, because status mattered to them more than the small statistical horror that lay behind it. The great carved sarcophagus in the family chapel was a monument of pride. That it might also, once in a generation, become the last room of a living person was a truth polite society preferred not to discuss. Something else the movies leave out. The scratch marks that workers occasionally found on the inside of medieval coffins were not always publicized. Priests, families, and local authorities frequently agreed, without ever writing it down, to close such coffins again in silence. To disturb the story would have raised questions no one wanted to answer. About the physician who had declared the death. About the family who had rushed the burial. About the entire fragile system that stood between the medieval world and the possibility that this could happen to any of them at any time. The silence was not because it did not happen. The silence was because it did. The church that knew everything. Now consider the strangest layer of this story. The church, in many places, was aware of the problem, and the church made quiet decisions about how to handle it. You have to remember that priests were the ones who prepared the dead. They were the ones who sat with the bodies through the vigils. They were the ones who oversaw the burials, and years later, when older graves needed to be cleared to make room for new ones, they were the ones who lifted the old bones out of the earth. They were the ones who lifted the old bones out of the earth. They saw everything. And what some of them saw, generation after generation, was a pattern too consistent to be a coincidence. In certain regions, church tradition began to require longer vigils before burial. 3 days. Sometimes more. The stated reason was to allow the soul time to depart properly. The quieter reason, understood by everyone involved, was to make absolutely certain that the body was not going to sit up. Some priests reportedly kept a small mirror by the shrouded face, checking it each morning for the faintest fog of breath. Some tapped the chest gently. Some watched for the slow changes of true death that no living body ever shows. These traditions were not written into official doctrine. They were passed from priest to priest, from parish to parish, in a way that difficult knowledge always travels in a serious institution. Not in the sermons. Not in the great books. In the small conversations between men who had opened too many coffins and learned to be cautious. Every time a family wondered why the priest was insisting on one more day of waiting, one more night of prayer over the body, they were usually not being asked to grieve longer. They were being quietly protected from a discovery no family should ever have to make. The screams stopped after a few hours. The silence lasted centuries. Why the coffin still matters. Step out of the crypt now. Walk back up the stone stair. Return to the sunlight. You might think a story like this belongs safely in a dark, superstitious past. Better medicine. Better tests for death. Better tombs. Surely we tell ourselves the terror of waking up inside a sealed box is a purely medieval nightmare, and modern life has retired it forever. Look closer. Even in the last century, before modern hospital equipment became universal, cases of mistaken death continued to be reported around the world. In our own age, doctors occasionally still record patients who were declared dead and then, sometimes minutes later, sometimes hours, showed unmistakable signs of life. The gap between appearing dead and being dead has narrowed enormously. It is not entirely closed. The medieval coffin sealed from the inside is not only a story about failed diagnosis. It is a story about how confident every age is that it can tell the living from the dead, and how wrong every age eventually turns out to have been in some small percentage of cases. The medieval physician did his best. He was often correct. When he was wrong, the consequences were unbearable, and the world learned to build small mechanisms and small traditions to reduce the risk. But it did not eliminate the risk. No age ever quite has. That is the deeper lesson these coffins leave us. Not that our ancestors were foolish, but that human beings have always lived on the edge of a line we cannot see clearly the line between being alive and being gone, and that some of our greatest terrors come from the moments when that line refuses to sit still. History remembers kings. It forgets what was buried beneath their churches, the lid you will never open. Now return one last time to that crypt. The coffin is closed again. The lid has been slid back into place, as the priest asked. The scratches are hidden once more from the world. Somewhere above, in the sunlit church, Mass is being said for the peaceful dead. The congregation does not know. The choir does not know. Only you, and the priest, and the ghosts of every worker who ever discovered the same thing in some other crypt of some other town, know what really lies beneath the stones they are standing on. Across Europe, in old churches you can still visit, there are coffins that have never been opened in the modern era. Some of them are undisturbed for the simplest of reasons, out of respect for the dead. Some remain closed for a quieter reason, because whoever last looked inside made a private decision that no one else should ever have to see what they saw. That decision has, in some places, held for centuries. And perhaps it should. Perhaps some doors and some lids are best left as our ancestors left them. Not because the truth does not matter, but because the truth in this case is a witness to a suffering that no living person can now help. And the least we owe those inside is the peace of not being reopened for our curiosity. If this made your skin crawl, hit subscribe, because next week we're opening another door history try to close. And before you go, comment below and tell me this. If you were a stonemason in that crypt, and you had just seen the scratches on the underside of the lid, would you have obeyed the priest and stayed silent for the rest of your life? Or would you have told the world? Your answer says more about you than you think. Because in the end, the truth about the past is often stranger than the myth.